fantasy, my old friend. How I've missed you. Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Katie, and if you have been following me for the last year and a half, you will know that I have been writing contemporary romance. But I think it's finally time to return to my roots and write fantasy again. Now, I didn't stop thinking about fantasy during the time that I was writing my contemporary romances. I've worked on a few things here and there throughout the last year and a half. Never anything concrete, never anything like drafting wise or anything that's like super important to work on. If you're new here, I always wrote fantasy. That was the genre that I wrote the most. It's what I started out writing. For the motorcycle to go by. And I actually never thought that I would ever write contemporary or romance like at all, but then I started working on my soulmate tennis romances and that kind of changed everything. And so I was really working on contemporary. It was very different for me to work on that as opposed to fantasy, which was, you know, all I'd ever worked on before. So it was very interesting getting to work on that and see the differences in them. I've talked about it before in other videos. I'll leave some links down below if you want to hear more of my thoughts on writing contemporary. And of course I still do have those projects, but I never had any intention of actually ever abandoning my writing projects that are fantasy based. So let's get into what's been happening, where we're going from this, and what's the new fantasy project I'm working on. Spoiler alert, it's not actually that new, which is a great segue into the origin of this current idea that I'm working on that we'll talk a little bit about later in the video. If you didn't know, one of my favorite books from childhood was Aragon by Christopher Paolini. I think this book series was definitely the getaway drug. Nope. I think this book series was definitely a gateway drug into fantasy for a lot of kids, and in my particular case, it ignited this love of dragons from a very young age. So I've always wanted to write a quote-unquote dragon book. So when I was around 13 or 14, I came up with a dragon book idea that I was going to write. And essentially the main core concept of it is very similar to the Eldunari. I don't actually know how to pronounce that, from the Aragon series, which if you haven't read that series, it's basically an organ that's in the dragon's body that holds its consciousness. And if the physical body of the dragon dies and that organ is still preserved, it means the dragon will still exist in consciousness and can still communicate with people. That's basically what my concept was. There was no more dragons, but there were these like consciousness of the dragons that were locked in this like cave of souls that was basically if you went there you went insane basically from all of the dragon knowledge. I don't know. And the monarchy, of course the evil monarchy, thought they had killed all the dragons, but the rebellion had saved these like dragon souls and were hoping that someday the dragons would regenerate or something. I didn't think that far into it. Again, you can see where my inspiration came from if you've read Aragon. You know where it came from. And so the main characters were ones that were chosen by the dragons and were, you know, coming to resurrect them from this cave in the mountains so they could get their kingdom back or something. It was not incredibly thought out, but this was the beginning of the idea that really started to spark what is now the book. And the idea of dragons being locked away by force is still something that exists in this current iteration of it. Now, I have hesitated to talk about this project. We've been hesitating to work on this project because of a fear. Now, any fantasy book is generally going to be a risk. The fantasy market for both YA and adult is pretty saturated and flooded with a lot of different types of books, and so it is very hard to break into that unless you go viral on TikTok or like you get a shit ton of promotion behind you with your publisher. Ultimately, it's very hard to break into the fantasy market and actually be successful in it. Plus, it takes a very long time to write and revise a fantasy book to go out into the career trenches. Which, quick sidebar, I have not given up on Cruel Summer, which is my soulmate tennis romance book that I'm currently in the career trenches with. I'm not giving up on it. It's still in there, but it is generally the advice from most people who are in the career trenches to be working on another book that you could create after it if it does fail, or so you have something else if a publisher wants to know what else you're working on, or your agent wants to know what else you're working on. So just a little tip of advice slash why I'm doing this. So you're not like, what happened to the other book? It's still there. So returning to this idea of fear, it is always in the forefront of my mind of how I'm going to manage my career. And anything I decide to work on does cost time, energy, creative flow. And so I try to be really conscious of what I decide to work on. The fact that there is a lot of construction happening outside, I do apologize if you can hear any of it. So I was really burnt out at the beginning of the year because I did write 500,000 words last year. Just flexing. And so I kind of came out of that at the end of February, early March, and I came up with this idea for a book that was called Like Actually. And so from the end of March to the end of July, I was working very religiously on this book. And I've spoken about it in a more roundabout way in several videos. If you want to know more about that project and specifically what it was about, you can go read some of my newsletters. I always have my newsletter link down below, so if you want to go subscribe, you totally can. This was a fully pantsed, fully contemporary romance idea that was, you know, full of introspection and kissing and frankly a lot of run-on sentences. romances. But it was definitely a bit of a refresher for me. I knew I would never really pursue publishing it. I kind of went in with the intention that like, this is not something I'm going to be querying. It'd be very difficult to query. The concept is very out of the range of trad pub at the moment. I knew all of the work that I was sinking into like actually wasn't going to give me a tangible physical product that would help me advance my career. Obviously, the fact that I wrote 100,000 words in that book does not mean that I did no work basically for those several months. I worked on my characterization, my prose, all of my work and stuff. Like I did grow as a writer working on like actually, but none of that currently gives me a physical object that I can hand to agents and be like, hey, represent me, publish me, choose me.
So pick me, choose me, love me.
And I'm not trying to downplay any of that work that I did do during that time or saying it was like dumb to do those things. Like I think you do need to have those projects that you just simply work on for the pleasure of working on them and like in growing your craft, but it was not going to get me closer to my goal of being a traditionally published author. It was freeing to not have the expectation of working towards something that was, you know, ultimately going to be pursued in the traditional publishing sphere. But when I decided to return to fantasy, because I basically was really itching to write fantasy again, like I was like,
Ooh, am I back in my fantasy era? Like, is that a wrap?
I realized that with whatever project I picked, I was going to be putting all my eggs in that basket for the foreseeable future. For now, at least, any fantasy is going to take me a long time to write and revise and like get up to snuff. I have been trying to write 3 for a Funeral or the Eclipse Project for about 3 years now. I'm still nowhere near having a complete first draft, despite the fact I've been working on it for 3 years straight. I did Pants the Wrath King back when I first wrote it, which was a strategy that did not work for me, ultimately, on the grand scheme of things. It did get me a book that was finished and like a first draft I could work on, but it did kind of set the book up for failure, is what I've kind of come to realize. And I'll have to make a whole video about that book and what it taught me in terms of writing and writing fantasy. But in short, I have realized, and I know now about my own process, that I have to sink a lot of time up front into characters and world building and plot and outlining and character creation and building believable storylines, you know, in order to create a successful book that I think will be like set up for the future. I can't pants fantasy effectively, is what I have learned over my many moons of writing fantasy books, which means that unlike Cruel Summer, which I wrote in about 60 days, revised in 3 months, and went on query after 8 months of rigorous work, that I have to really put a lot of hard work into the fantasy book that I didn't have to put into the contemporary, because a lot of the contemporary, luckily, is built on things that people already know. You do have to do a lot less world building, a lot less upfront brunt work to write a contemporary. I can just pants a contemporary without having to worry about it, because I don't have to really like look at things, you know, I don't have to come up with things on my own, because when I create a fantasy world, I really like to build it from the ground up. Ultimately, to me, that is really scary, because that means I have to put even more years and even more time into it, and it takes me a lot longer to get the momentum built into a book that I feel like can have a fully fleshed out thing, can actually stand on its own. And it's not like I'm afraid of doing that hard work for the projects. I mean, I've been doing that hard work seriously for about 4 years now, and it's not the doing of the work, but it's the rat race of it all. It's the wheel that turns on endlessly. It's the grind of it all. And ultimately the fear is that it won't pay off. And it's scary to think about that, which is why if you're struggling with this as well, I always fall back on the advice of write what you want to read, because if you write to trends, eventually the trend will be over and you'll be stuck with a book that you actually don't love and you don't give a shit about and you're super uninspired by it. So write what you want to read, right? But so even though I am working hard and would like to work hard and like want to look hard, I'm looking forward to this hard work, I want to make sure that what I'm choosing ultimately will help me move forward in my career, or at least at this moment will help me move forward and move towards a tangible product that can help me get towards my end goal. Give me the best chance to win this race. And some of my books, I'll be quite honest, are much more marketable than others. That's just the truth that I have come to learn. There's no judgment in that. It's not like those books are better than the ones that are less marketable, or the ones that are less marketable or like more creative than the ones that are marketable. Like it's not a judgment call on that at all. It just means that I've realized that I have to choose very wisely about what books I choose to pursue at this moment, and that there's a lot that I have to think of, you know, before I even start the work on the book itself, you know, to really commit to a book. Because I'm really bad at commitment. It's the thing about me. So you've heard all of that and you're thinking to yourself, but Katie, why now? Why this book? Why? How did you come to this decision?
Why?
What about all those things that you decide in your brain, hey, that's a good idea, let's do that one? Well, let's start with the obvious. I had been thinking about this book for the last several months, along with another idea. They kind of were competing. They're both on kind of like, if you think of my brain like an oven, but like an oven that has like 13 thingies, they're on the highest heat, essentially is what I like to describe it as. The other one is called tentatively Sister Serpentine, and it's kind of like a branch off of the Wrath King. It does lean into things that are more marketable. Like, it has a very sultry, sensual atmosphere, and it's modern, which is just easier for readers to read and get into. And it is spicier than the book that I did end up choosing, which certain audiences, especially ones that will tend to blow things up, will gravitate towards. That's just what we've been seeing just within the TikTok sphere of the last couple of years. But the problem with that one is I don't really have a cohesive idea of what that story is. A lot of characters, I have a lot of set, I have a lot of like ideas of what like is included in the book, but I don't know what themes I'm exploring. What am I trying to unravel within it? Like, if it's not a theme, is it like a character thing? What questions am I asking while I'm writing and then I'm trying to get to the heart of? What am I trying to dig at? A lot of my writing process is trying to pull back layers and see what I'm trying to process within myself, or what I'm trying to like express within the landscape of a story. And of course, sometimes I write without those in mind, or I have them subconsciously in my mind. But when it comes to fantasy, I really find that it's important for me to have those core elements so I don't lose my way within the story, because there's a lot more elements, there's a lot more through lines, there's a lot more just ground to cover in general in a fantasy. And so I don't want to lose my way with what I'm actually trying to say or like tell or like question or like come up with, you know, like it doesn't have to be like super like, you know, deep and, you know, profound. It's just something that I'm working towards that I can always kind of come back to. When I get too far into the weeds, I can be like, okay, well, where is home? Where am I trying to get to? What is this core that I'm really trying to drive home at? And I need to have that emotional through line. I need to have those emotional beats and those elements within myself, or else I'll just get lost. And that's one of the problems I have found with the Wrath King in any of the drafts, despite the fact that I've tried really to, you know, suffuse themes into it. I have found that without that, it's just kind of a sinking sandcastle. So with this book, with the Dragon book, I have those emotional through lines. I've always kind of had those emotional through lines. I knew what I wanted with it. I had this flutter of an idea. I had even comps that I wanted to run with. But what really pushed me into writing the book was actually a video. A Reads with Rachel video. She is one of my favorite YouTubers. I highly recommend checking out her channel. I absolutely adore her. And it is this one specifically where she talks about Fourth Wing. I'm not here to pass judgment on Fourth Wing. I have not read the book. I'm not even here to say something like, oh, well, I could do it better. Like, I'm just really, I'm not here to pass any judgment on Fourth Wing as a book. But I was watching this video and Rachel had a bunch of questions about the book, specifically about its world building and things that were happening in it. And I was like, wait, wait a minute. I know the answer to that. I know how that works in my specific Dragon book. So inspired by her critique of this book and her talking about this book. I always find myself super inspired by critique anyway, whether it's of my favorite book, a book I hate, if it's of my own book. And so I literally, after watching that video, I went and I cranked out like 3,000 words of world building, character work, and an outline. And that really solidified for me that this was the book I was ready to work on. Plus, I was always really inspired by this idea. I mean, I've had it literally since I was 14 years old, but I'd never had the pieces click together in the way that made them satisfying until the end of July when I did watch this video. So I really started doing some steady work on it. I really started to dive into it. Since then, nothing has waned. In fact, I feel like this book is more within my grasp than ever. The reason I'm making this video is because I'm going on a writing retreat tomorrow, actually. So that'll be like the real test of like getting a lot of work done and getting ready to like draft the book. Ah, it's fine, it's fine. Oh, I've scratched myself. I'm not bleeding, but I did have like a thing. Anyway, so we're gonna talk about the book a little bit. This is not an all about my novel video, which are videos that I've made in the past, most notably for my two other big fantasy projects. One is The Wrath King, which was my second video I ever made. I don't recommend watching it. If you do, you get to see a lot of awkward Katie. The one for Three for a Funeral is quite accurate still, so if you want kind of like an idea of what those videos entail, I'll leave them linked. Even though that is not what this video is, I still want to kind of generally introduce it to you. You have some form of grounding whenever I talk about this project and whenever I like discuss it. Luckily, I do have a title. It's very tentative. It probably will change within the process, but it is tentatively called The Draconian Legacy. I describe this book as being a high fantasy and a science fiction kind of genre blend. It is definitely adult, and the characters are roughly around like 21 years old. I originally comped it, and whenever I've talked about this book in the past, because I've said that it is Aragon meets Pacific Rim meets Dead Poet Society, which is still a good idea of the vibes of the book. But if you wanted more book comps, I would say it's more like Fourth Wing meets The Atlas Six meets Iron Widow. Those are kind of the general vibes of what's going on, of what's cooking. And I am a girlie who loves writing in third person, so you know this book's going to be in third person because I do not like first person for myself. But since I started writing romances, I've really fallen in love with present tense, and I really like writing in present tense. So this is third person present tense. At the moment, there are 4 confirmed POVs, but I would kind of like to have 7. So anyway, let's talk about the vibes, because I love a vibey book. I love a book that vibes, and it's gone through so many changes throughout the years. Originally, it was very medieval, typical Tolkien-esque world. Then I had more of a dystopian vibe, which leaned a little bit more into like the Pacific Rim aesthetic of it. But now I'm leaning more into a like modern society, not dystopia, but it is definitely leaning more into the 1960s, 70s aesthetic. I have a lot more notes about this that I could go into, but I am restraining myself. But the science fiction element of this book means that this book cannot be set within the past or like a past aesthetic, because there are very specific tech things that the book hinges on. I basically had to research when those tech things started to come into play. It turns out it's the 60s and 70s. For example, augmented and virtual reality, which was used for things like medical and flight simulation, as well as military training, starting in the 1970s. Cloning actually began in 1952, which was used on a tadpole, and then again on a carp in 1963. Dolly the sheep, though, was cloned in 1996, but the tech was being developed and grown in the 60s and 70s. It doesn't have to be in the 1990s, it just has to have like been existing and like a thing within the scientific field. Pressure suits were actually invented in the 1930s, and pressure suits are basically what would allow you to go up into high altitudes and not die. And obviously, like, we went to the moon in 1969, so like that shit definitely existed, and so they can exist within this world, although instead of flying spacecraft into high altitudes, they're flying dragons, but similar principles exist. Plus, because I'm setting it in like a 1960s, 70s era, I get to do cool things like use Polaroids, motorcycles, telephones, and oral contraceptives, which is just fun, just fucking fun. That kind of idea and stuff kind of clicked together. The fact that I love dark academia, and the majority of this first book will be taking place at a dragon training academy. It very much became fantasy, science fiction, 1960s dark academia. It's essentially what kind of like cinched together the rest of the book. Sounds fun, right? Luckily though, a lot of those things still work really well with a lot of the original inspirations that I had for the book back when I jotted them down back in 2021, when I first kind of was like thinking like, oh, what if I did this, but with dragons, basically. And I think I've talked about this before, but I'm just gonna read through the vibes that I have that continue to be true to this day. Eldritch dragons that are revered as gods, but are actually kind of fucking terrifying. Boarding school vibes, again, the dark academia. There's inspiration from the Blackfires from the Song of Ice and Fire. We'll talk a little bit about the characters, and if you know anything about the Blackfires from the Song of Ice and Fire, you will see the inspiration. You'll see it. It'll hit you in the face. Queer found family, because of course, obviously, duh, it's me. Grumpy and Grumpy. Instead of Grumpy Sunshine, it's Grumpy Grumpy, because I love that dynamic and I feel like we don't see enough of it. Gifted Kid Burnout, because Gifted Kid Burnout right here. Scientific experimentation. You know, I'm just also kind of tired of like this medieval vibe aesthetic. I have a lot of books that are set in medieval times, or like medieval, you know. The Wrath King is very typical fantasy in that way, but this is more scientifically advanced. Bullying is flirting. Let me help you be less sheltered / like the bucket list trope. Deep sea horrors and magic no one understands, but the phasing out of magic because of science, like a conversation about magic and science together. Dream, memory, and soul magic. That is kind of a blanket theme that happens within all of my books. I have very large themes about memory and dreams and souls and stuff. Like, it's very much a motif within my books. Politics galore. There's a lot of politics in this book already. One of the first ideas I ever had for this book was the romanticized idea of heroism, because I feel like with dragons, even when like the slaying of dragons by the knight, you know, to save the damsel in distress, is very rooted in his heroism and stuff. So I feel like that is kind of intrinsic to dragon stories in general, but less killing of dragons and more like, you know, there's knight in shining armor riding a dragon to save the people, you know? Feral girls. There's a bunch of girls in this story that are just absolutely fucking feral. And of course, familial trauma and pressures of expectations, all of it going together. And so all of that, along with everything else I was talking about with the comps and the world and the science and the stuff, they're very much the threads that hold this world together. So let's talk very briefly about the characters. I'm not going to go into depth, but I do want to kind of give you an idea of who we're working with. So in this class, we follow 9 dragon riders in training. So the first one is Lyseno, or Lys, who is a spoiled, pretty rich kid from a legacy family, which basically means that he is descended from one of the first human riders in this world. There is Alexi, who dreamed of being a dancer like his mother, but obviously being chosen by a dragon kind of puts those dreams on hold, kind of says that's not happening. There's Lisa, who is absolutely fucking feral and kind of insane, but like in a very fun, morally gray way. I am kind of obsessed with her. She's very fun. She's crazy. I love her. There's Kova, who is a former princess and has been sheltered her entire life. There's Christiane, who is a party girl and definitely isn't holding back a dark secret. There's Valin, who is from a cult known for killing dragons. That's definitely a red flag when it comes to the fact that you're going to a dragon academy. And then finally, we have Bryn and Kiernan, who are 2 bastards of the Emperor that were acknowledged because of their marks. And of course, they have a very passionate rivalry that is also incredibly toxic. And yes, they do in fact hate each other. No, there's no incest like the Blackfires and like Game of Thrones, Targaryens in general. No incest, don't worry. Beyond them, like in the school itself, there are 6 professors. There are 4 former graduates who have come back to kind of train, and they kind of end up becoming like older siblings to the rest of the characters. Then there's a rider who has lost his dragon. Ugh, I just have such a soft spot for him. His name's Dominic. I love him. And then the other professor, the final professor, is the Emperor's brother, who's a writer, of course, and there is something very strange with him going on. He's very interesting. And then the school has a director who is simply known as the Wolf. There are 2 brilliant engineers who may be giving the kids pyrotechnics when they shouldn't. And there's a really funky librarian, because of course there's a funky librarian who is definitely a recluse but loves their library and history, and is very fun to just like think about them being just chaotic in general, but like in a quiet chaotic kind of way, and like a
if you touch my books, I will cut your hand off.
And as for the dragons, which are the most important part of this book that I haven't talked about very much, I won't say much about them, because the main dragons in this book series are different than the dragons that you will meet in the beginning of the book. They're different. They're built different. And all I'm gonna say is that when I was writing their personalities and their histories, I was listening to Karma by Taylor Swift on repeat. So take with that what you will. I am very much still working on putting together a cohesive Pinterest board, but you can follow it if you want. I'll put a link down below. It's not great. It's not my best mood board Pinterest board thing, but if you want to see more about it and like kind of get more of the vibes that are happening there, you can. Music, of course, is a very big inspiration for me. I love Bastille's newest album. I've started re-listening to it again. It's called Give Me the Future. Love it. Spectacular. Bastille is just, I love Bastille. And of course, lyrics often correlate to characters, of course. I actually have an Instagram post that talks about some of the songs that go along with characters. And so ultimately, what I've kind of realized as I've been working on this book is that a lot of the ideas that I'm working on and working with are in conversation with other ideas that I've been working with, and elements of that, like science and magic, loneliness and understanding, trust and betrayal, dreams and reality, revenge and empathy. Like there's a lot of like competing things. So there's a lot of competing vibes within the playlists and the mood boards and the Pinterest boards, and like even within the things that I talk about with it. But I think this is important because this creates a kind of push and pull tension that I think will translate into the book, into the characters and the plot, and of course into the themes of the book. That is ultimately all I can tell you about the Dragon Book right now. Follow me on Instagram if you want to know more about that, and I'll be posting more about this project obviously on this channel. I am going on a writing retreat, so you're gonna get to see more of that. So yeah, I clearly have missed talking about fantasy. I've missed it so much. If you're interested in anything I've talked about thus far, or you want to see more of my rambling face, you can subscribe. Yeah, I'm so bad at talking about that, but I'd love if you were here and joining me on my journey. Let me know about your books down below. Definitely like if you want to see more content like this, and let me know what other kind of content you want to see, because your bitch is back in her fantasy era. Next time you see me, I'll be hopefully writing this book furiously and working more in the outline, and maybe even drafting a little bit. In the middle of nowhere by a lake. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for sticking around. If you have, or if you're new here, thank you for being here. I will see you in my next one. Bye.